So, hello and welcome to the D365 Insights Podcast brought to you by Source and Connect. Today is episode 17, The Reality of Planning in Dynamics 365 Supply Chain. This episode will be very interesting for manufacturing and supply chain businesses who are embarking on ERP implementations. Today, we are welcoming planning expert Roger Fleury. Roger has more than 30 years in the business and is going to share that wisdom with us. So, welcome. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, Roger.
That's a pleasure. Yes, no problem at all.
Good, good. So, to start us off, can you give listeners a quick overview of your background and how you've ended up specializing in supply chain planning within D365?
Almost by accident, to be honest. Yeah, but that's probably common with a
Usually
lot
the
of people.
case.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, I started a long time ago as a production engineer, working for machine manufacturing companies and the like,
yeah,
their movement. And I got co-opted onto their ERP implementation. So, yeah, the short story there was 2 years later and 4 sites, and I got hooked on ERP implementations and business process mapping. So
yeah,
suddenly I was no longer an engineer, but I was seen as an IT person.
yeah. That's quite a common
um,
route, isn't it, into dynamics, whether it's supply chain or finance, coming from
yeah, I
industry.
think it is. I think it is, and
Yeah,
I think that it's the benefit that you bring, practical experience, combine it with the software side, and then you end up having a set of skills that are valuable to other people. So
mm,
yeah, I joined the supplier who supplied the initial IT system, and the rest is history. So quite a few implementations down the line, and I still love the complexity of supply chain. So gets me out of bed in the morning.
yeah, fantastic. So you've been working with AX and D365 for a long time. Why do you think planning remains one of the hardest areas for organizations to get right?
Well, I mean, planning is one of those, should we say, soft skills. I mean, it's a people thing as much as anything else. It also goes to the heart of the complexity of ERP. It's where all the pieces of the jigsaw have to come together. You can't just get sales right. You can't just get manufacturing right. Planning has to be coordinating. So there's some people call it different things, but sales and operations planning is more of a people thing than a software thing. Obviously, it's driven by data nowadays, but data without methodology and understanding the business requirements, it's a nice complex area. So
Yeah. And for those, I mean, most people that are going to be listening to this are going to understand what planning is, but how would you explain planning? What does that actually mean?
um, I suppose for me, planning is the art of making sure that all parts of the business are working together.
Yeah.
So, in today's world, you can't just wait for somebody to order something and then think you can make it and deliver it. You've got to do it in advance. You've got to plan, you've got to get materials in, you've got to have resources in place, warehouses available, trucks, distribution. And then you have to make sure that they all add up. So there's no holes. I mean, supply chain planning, you think of a chain as a linear thing, and it's definitely not linear nowadays. It's a much more a matrix type complex scenario we're dealing with. But in terms of a chain, if you get the weakest link concept, the whole chain can fall apart just for the sake of one part of that process failing and not being strong enough to manage the rest. So yeah, it's definitely one of the hardest areas, and there's no right answers there either. You can't make saying 2 + 2 = 4 doesn't always add up when you're planning.
Yeah. So, what originally drew you into the planning side of supply chain rather than other areas like warehousing or manufacturing execution?
I think for me, it is that combination of the people element and the impact that the right thought process can have on it. I love working with people. I love training people. Yeah, coding software and delivering software, that's just a tool. What you're trying to build is a business process. So of all the areas, it's that business process concept that how to get flow through a business, how to get control over it, how to make things happen.
Hmm.
It's yeah. I mean that's what keeps me going. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So, when organizations say we're struggling with planning in D365, what does that usually look like in practice?
Well, I suppose planners are very very resourceful people, and planning can happen. It's the proverbial swan moment. Everything looks fine, but underneath, planners going there. It's when all that hard work from planners then ripples out into the rest of the business, and you end up with shortages or expedites or production downtimes or failure to deliver or whatever. So 99% of the time, the rest of the business doesn't suffer because planners somehow pull it out of the hat. But the reality is that's a very tough job to do if you don't have the right systems and support in place. So I think planning is often also blamed for other problems. So it's always a planning problem when things don't go to plan. But it's not necessarily the plan that was wrong. It's everything else around it that wasn't right at the time. So it's easy to blame planning. But it's also one where you see it right and everything flows and everything works. Then you can definitely see that planning is working. So it's easier to justify good planning than it is to criticize bad planning.
Yeah, definitely. So where do you most commonly see the disconnect between what D365 planning is capable of and how it's actually being used?
Well, I think the thing about D365 planning is that it's much the same as with any full ERP system. It's driven by the data that's within the system. So there's two drivers here in terms of getting the right results. One is, have you got accurate data? So if there's lots of poor dates, poor quantities, missing data, etc., then obviously planning systems are not gonna work effectively. And then you have to have the right methodology to actually interpret that and map it to the business processes you're trying to support. So D365 at the end of the day is just a piece of software. It'll do what you ask it to do. It's quite flexible, etc. But if you think you can just work off one set of data and accept that I've done my job, then I've come up with a recommendation, get on with it, then reality kicks in, and plans. The whole point of planning is that you have to be prepared to change. So that's the challenge with D365, keeping it up to date, keeping it flexible.
Yeah. Okay. So traditional MRP is still at the heart of many environments. What problems does that create for modern supply chains?
I mean, where do I start? I mean, MRP as a concept, I can't, when I read the books and that, I can't believe it was like came around sort of 60 years ago, which is quite scary. And it was never designed for the complexity that we face nowadays. It was improved and extended in the 1980s to include sort of things like what they call MRP2, capacity planning, financial planning, holistic, full ERP planning in that respect. But at the end of the day, master planning is about matching supply and demand, and it tries to come up with a perfect solution, a single answer, and expects you to follow it. So there's no inbuilt support for volatility or failure or late delivery or anything like that. It's completely reactive. So the answer you get from master planning today is going to be different from the answer you get from master planning tomorrow. It could even be different from the answer that master planning gives you in the afternoon. So stability is not built into master planning, and that's what most people need nowadays. There's so much going on that if you have a planning system that's not based on promoting stability, then it's not really fit for purpose in that respect in today's marketplace.
Yeah. So why do so many planning teams end up falling back on Excel even after investing heavily in D365?
Well, finally, I mean, I've seen implementations where I think planners haven't even left Excel. It's about having the flexibility to suit the business requirements that are needed. I suppose again, master planning comes up with one set of numbers, and then reality hit, and you need flexibility in order to cope with that. And there's a lot of requirements where businesses have unique constraints, and to try and get that into a standard engine like master planning, you just can't do it. And the the visualization of data is often a problem in that you can generate the data in master planning. Okay, you can surface it through tools like Power BI, etc. But to interact with it and manage that data is a challenge, especially when you're talking about volumes of data that you get nowadays.
Yeah.
So it doesn't surprise me that people constantly want tools that they're comfortable with, they know how to manage, and they feel like they're in control. Obviously, that causes problems that they're not necessarily directly interfaced with the main systems, and then you get islands of data and inaccuracies that way. But at the end of the day, if it supports what the planner's trying to do, you can't help but incorporate it, because you've got to come up with a practical, realistic solution for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So at what point do teams typically stop trusting the system, and why is that such a dangerous place to be?
Trusting the system, I suppose, for a lot of implementations, then it's not about trusting the system, it's about expectation. What I've been talking about here with master planning is not new. People have known it for many years. But there's almost an acceptance that, well, the only thing we've got is master planning. We have to use it. It comes up with a certain set of recommendations, but we know it's not quite what we want. Therefore, we'll just treat it as one thing that we use, and then we build out what we actually need outside of it. So if your expectations are low in terms of what the solution can deliver you, then it's not a question of trust. You just accept that it is what it is, and then you roll up your sleeves and you get on and do your day job. So
Yeah, sort of go off piece a little bit.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So, in your experience, are planning problems usually caused by data, process, or behavior, or a combination of all three?
Well, all of those can contribute to problems. If you got inaccurate data, you've got changes of behavior, supply behavior. One week they're good, and the next week they're just letting you down. Those sort of things. But I think all of those are all part of the reality that planning have to cope with. Which is part of the expectation of how flexible the system can be in terms of responding to those changes that have occurred. But I think the biggest impact that we find, that I've certainly seen in implementations, are where it's definitely human man-made, and it's decision making by management in terms of you get closer and closer to the year end, and finance turn around and say, can you knock 5 million off of stock, please? And sales are saying, well, we're trying to ramp up sales to hit our year end target. So you've got demand to drive stock down, and you've got sales wanting to sell more. Then the weather comes along and changes the profile of the products that you're trying to sell. So those are the things that have the big impact. And what you need there is a system that can cope with that. But hygiene factors such as data and control, etc. Then obviously those have to be addressed generally anywhere. So
Yeah, absolutely. So what are the early warning signs that a planning setup is going to struggle, even if the system has been implemented correctly?
well, I mean the obvious thing is where people aren't planning on the system. They're built up a complex set of procedures and processes, and as much as everybody loves Excel, and then you find a parallel system in terms of planning. They're fine when they're fine. They break when either people are not there on holiday, or the volumes change. The biggest problem, one of the other big problems, is that they're not quick to react, because they're based on a set of assumptions. Excel, you build a model out, very difficult to check every formula if you then have to start changing the assumption behind it. Big changes in data in an ERP system often aren't reflected directly in such subsystems as Excel, etc.
So how do you manage that then, to if you've got individuals that are sort of using planning, but they're using their own systems as well? How do you kind of manage that and ask them not to, or yeah, what's the solution there?
Well, I mean, if you're trying to, I mean, you've got two main types of implementation. There's the ones that you have to accept that you have to support what they're doing, you have to simplify it, you have to validate it, and certainly cross-train people, go through and document what's happening there, because most of the Excel spreadsheets aren't documented.
Yeah.
So if there's an acceptance that for this implementation we're going to have to embrace those subsystems and solutions, then you try to make them as robust as possible, both from the people side and the documentation side, and then stress test them with data, etc., to make sure that updates, etc., working for that, and even little things like making sure all the passwords are saved. I had one where somebody forgot the password for a spreadsheet, password protected, and you couldn't get in. Guy was on holiday. Not good that one. But if you're looking at trying to improve things and bring systems on board in terms of bringing them into the fold within the ERP, then what you're talking about there is a complete re-education and change management process. So that's a whole different ball game in terms of supporting existing mindset and thing, and it starts with education. You have to get people to rethink what they're trying to achieve, because I've never met a planner that doesn't want to do a good job. I've never met a planner that's not dedicated and trying as hard as he can to deliver what the rest of the business wants. But they very rarely have enough time to take one step back and actually go, why or how am I trying to achieve this? And is there a better way? That's the ideal, where an implementation of ERP gives us time to do that, hopefully, if the organization is prepared to do it.
Yeah. So how much of the challenge is about volatility and uncertainty versus how organizations try to control it?
Control's an interesting word. I don't think anybody really can control volatility and all of that. That's just life. I mean, there's obviously certain things you can do to mitigate against sort of problems in supply chains. There's a big impact at the moment about sort of like onshoring and bringing supply chain, making supply chains shorter, because they've extended worldwide over the last few decades. Multi-sourcing is a big issue now in terms of not being reliant on single source supply and things like that. So practical aspects of that can be controlled from a risk point of view, but from a planning point of view, I think for me the key is to just embrace the fact that volatility and things happen, and you have to be able to react to it. So building a planning system that's assuming variability, not based on a single calculated forecast figure, and based on a range of possibilities is what you need to do. And then if some things go slightly astray, some things are late, some things are higher, some things are lower, then you're within your bounds of control. So you're not always reacting, because that's the worst thing, is that you do all this work to set all these transactions up, place purchase orders, place manufacturing orders, schedule, etc. But if what you've done is based on a single figure, and if that figure doesn't come off, then you've naturally got a mismatch between what you've planned and what you're trying to achieve. And then you're instantly into firefighting, adjustments, expediting, etc.
Yeah. Okay, so do you see differences in planning maturity between manufacturers and distributors using D365?
Definitely, and it's not based on the size of the organization or the money they spend. I think it's very much but down to the mindset of the individuals that are involved in the organizations. I've worked with some big implementations where I suppose the almost the complexity of what they're trying to achieve is just been too much. Therefore, they make assumptions, try and push it in, and they're driven by, I've got to get this done in this time scale. We can't afford to do any changes. We've got to replicate what we do at the moment. But I think the pressure on organisations to get it right now is greater. In COVID, we saw the impact of poor supply chains, and supply chain suddenly becomes a term that the everyday person knows about, because there's no toilet rolls on the shelves. That's a pretty fundamental failure of a supply chain planning. But I think what you do find still is there's still a big tension in organisations between expectations of different departments. In terms of and that's can be as simple as just the the targets that people put on individual areas and managers. If you're targeting a production process to be based on OEE and maximizing output, you're not really putting anything in place to allow for variability, and making more of the stuff that you don't need. It's great from an output point of view, but doesn't necessarily help your overall supply chain, the flow of product through the business to support what customers actually want at the time. So I think I think, I don't know whether maturity is the right word, because it's an ongoing process here. It's just an appreciation that it's the sum of all the efforts that you have to coordinate across an organisation that matters.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to successful D365 programs. So when you look at D365 planning programs that genuinely work, what do they tend to get right from the start?
I think, well, the ones that have been most successful are the ones that actually have a holistic view of what we're trying to achieve. It's very easy from my side of the fence, a consulting and IT point of view, is just to dive into the detail, start working on the data, start working on training people up with the standard software, and assume that if you do all the individual pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, they all come together because the software must work. I think the most successful ones I've worked with is where we do a program of understanding where the constraints are in the business, what are the risks within the business processes that exist, and then see where implementing a new solution can help with mitigating those risks. The IT and software is not the only answer, and it's not the magic wand that solves all these physical problems. And sometimes you do have to live. If you've got a constraint of a production capacity, or you've got a warehouse issue that needs completely redesigning and you haven't got time to do it, or it's too small or whatever, and then you have to incorporate those in as a constraint in terms of the planning. But it's those where the team sit down and think about, we've got an integrated system, we're going to work off the proverbial one version of the truth. Well, that only works if we're actually all talking the same language and trying to achieve the same thing rather than pulling in different directions. So yeah, less haste, more speed is definitely the case in terms of getting the planning system up and running right.
Okay, brilliant. So how important is organizational mindset compared to system configuration when it comes to planning success?
Well, I think, based on what we've already talked about, it's critical. It's absolutely critical. I mean, the thing about the configuring of the software and the data requirements, to me, they are things which are sort of day-to-day tools. You can change them. If the requirements of the business change, or the reality changes of the environment that the business is working in, you have to go in and change. And that's probably different from a lot of areas. If you think in terms of, if you look at finance, once you've set a chart of accounts up, would you really be changing your chart of accounts just because of a small operational change in the business? Your products, the design of them, the physical bill of materials, and all the engineering data, get it right, and it basically stays until you have an engineering change. Operations is different. Operations should be flexible. It needs to change. Therefore, the configuration you set up almost it's right on the day you do it, but it's not necessarily right the next week. So you have to, more than anything, I think you have to train the people up to manage that configuration so that the system stands a chance of keeping up to date with the reality of what it's having to face with. And that's a hard one, because a lot of implementations I've done, there's a lack of knowledge transfer about the management of that configuration data. That's a hard one to take on board, because it needs people in the business that understand the business, understand the data they're dealing with, and then also understands the system to the level that they can change the levers and change the settings in the system. But for planning and operations management, that's what you need. Else you're running a system that churns out results and recommendations that were wrong 6 months ago, and you wonder why you're doing things in a spreadsheet. That's without keeping the configuration up to date. Then it's no wonder that people just, I've got my day job, I'll do it off system. I hear that a lot.
So when you're talking about the configuration, having the people in the business that have the knowledge, are they typically permanent employees within the business, or are they contractors that come in and kind of help with that configuration, in your experience?
Well, during the implementation process, you often get contractors such as myself, coming in to help do that configuration.
Yeah.
The critical thing is, the one thing you have to recognize with contractors is they're great while they're there, but you've got to get the knowledge out of them, and then you need to replace that with some internal control and internal knowledge.
Yeah.
So, that knowledge transfer for me is critical as part of an implementation process,
Yeah.
much more than anything else. And it's not something that you can just write a standard operating procedure and hand over, because again, a standard operating procedure assumes the set of configuration that you hand over on that day. You change the configuration and the procedures changed. It's something that's more it evolves quicker in operations than it does in finance or engineering or any other area of the ERP system.
Yeah, definitely. So, what role does cross-functional alignment play, particularly between sales, operations, and supply chain?
Wow, long question. Everything. Ultimately, this is the challenge, isn't it? It's not, when we're trying to put a planning system into place, there might be people who have a hat that says, I'm material planner, I'm demand planner, I'm supply planning, etc. But they can only work and come up with solutions for the business and answers for the business when all the other departments are contributing to it. Be it finance, be it warehouse management, be it production, be it sales. All of those have inputs. Unexpected marketing promotions cause havoc in some businesses because they don't talk about it. But that's sales and operations planning. That's not a software thing. That's an operational management thing. From a system point of view, for better or worse, we tend to subdivide the management of an ERP system, and you look at you're the specialist in finance, you look after that area. You're the engineer, you look after that area. With supply chain being so dependent on the data with all these different areas, then that often falls between the stalls of, well, just to get a simple supply chain change, I've got to talk to somebody about changing supply, I've got to change the bill of materials, I've got to change a warehouse setting, and it's managing all of that. It's an interesting area where I think we could well move into an area where this is where AI and AI automation can help. That our silo approach of just cutting down the complexity so people can manage systems is something that AI can do for us. So that is an area I'm very hopeful that we can see some good cross-departmental solutions coming up with AI.
Yeah, definitely. So, how should organizations think about variability and buffers rather than trying to forecast everything perfectly?
Well, this goes back to the heart of what drives MRP and master planning. From a very simple process point of view, if you don't know what a customer wants in the time frame that it takes you to supply it, then you've got to predict it, you've got to forecast it. The issue there, though, is that the classic master planning takes a forecast, one single figure, explodes it through all of its information and bill of materials, etc., and comes up with lots of recommendations. What day of the month was that forecast plugged in? And would change dramatically when the recommendations are. Nobody believes a forecast is 100% accurate. You can, if you go and Google forecast accuracy, you'll see lots of people talking about how to improve forecast accuracy. But when you get 70, 75 above percentage accuracy, or whatever the percentage is, you're never 100%. So you're inherently baking decision making and processes based on something which starts off being inaccurate. So if it's inaccurate to start with, it's not going to be accurate to finish, and that's without any variability of change that you bring in through the process. So buffers as a concept, inventory buffers, are just a very simple way of saying, well, if we're not making it to order, we're going to make it to stock, and then we expect the stock to satisfy what the customer needs. If we can't predict perfectly what the customer needs, we have to keep a certain amount of stock in. How do we work that out? So there's a methodology behind buffers that allow us to calculate buffers to say, within these tolerances, this variability, these are the levels that we need in these inventory buffers. And that works as a shock absorber to changes in the business. And one of the biggest benefits of buffers is really it gives just a much simpler, clearer view of what you need to do to keep things flowing.
Mm.
Because built into the buffer concept is a very simple red, amber, green methodology to highlight what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done. So I think that's not to say forecasting isn't important. I think there's the one thing you just don't want to do is to drive your whole business planning process off a single set of forecast numbers. If you can put something in the way that takes some of that variability out with buffers, then you can plan to buffers, and then buffers support the forecast.
Yeah. Okay. So what KPIs or outcomes actually matter when judging whether planning is working, and which ones are often misleading?
Well, the ultimate for me, the ultimate KPI is on time in full for a customer. Are you satisfying what your customers need? Regardless of how fickle they are and how changeable they are, if you can still deliver what the customer needs within the time that they want it, then you've got to say that's an absolute, you tick the box. But behind that, there's a whole load of metrics that people try to operate, and that's where we mentioned previously, certain metrics in certain areas, fight against the requirements. I think on time in full for supplier management, I've got a different view about it. I mean, you can see that a supplier is doing what you've asked him to do, but it's not necessarily what you need him to do. So if you've got something like a buffer in place and a supplier is a little bit late, it has no impact on the flow of the process and the delivery of the on time in full that you truly need, which is for the customer on time in full. I think the key that people need to do is to revisit their KPIs that they're building and say, does this truly promote flow in the business? Are we or are we just trying to optimize one small part of our business processes that actually is to the detriment of others? That can be a whole sub project. KPI management, change management. Design, they're just highlights of management thinking. It's very easy to incentivize the production floor to do more, but it may not be actually what you need, because then you find you've got too much stock, and then 6 months later you've got lots of write-offs for obsolescence, and then you go around the loop saying, why did I pay bonuses to get stuff to be produced that now I'm writing off, and then finance are not happy again. So it can be a virtuous circle if you get it right, but it also is a vicious circle that you can tie organizations up, and people only naturally want to drive their performance based on their own individual metrics. So that's it's very easy to get that out of alignment with the overall business objective, which should be to improve flow, improve efficiency, and deliver what our customer wants.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to some sort of common mistakes and hard-won lessons, which I think would be quite interesting for any manufacturing businesses that are listening to this. So what mistakes do you see repeated again and again in D365 planning projects?
I think fundamentally it's a case of the biggest mistake I've seen is really, and it has happened so many times, is that customers end up changing the software but end up with the same system because they've got what they already had. And that's the default position if you don't work hard, because you do discovery, you find out how the business works, etc. You're under timescale pressure, money pressure, etc. If you ask somebody, are you happy? They'll instantly say, yes, I'm happy if you give me what I've already got. So screens look prettier. The solution is implemented, but actually you've brought no real change to the business. So risk in terms of implementation is directly related to the amount of change that you're trying to implement. So then the question comes is, what change is right, what change is wrong, and which ones support the business process improvements that you're trying to achieve. So from a practical point of view, that's the biggest mistake, is just generating what you've already done.
Yeah, okay. So where do organizations most commonly underestimate the effort involved?
Well, I think that's, I I don't think businesses generally underestimate the effort. What they tend to do, though, is that they don't plan properly to allow those key users that are going to have the biggest impact on the implementation to have enough time.
Mm,
By their very nature, the people that can contribute most to this change process and design and implement the new system are the ones that know the most about the business and probably are contributing most to the management of that business at the moment. They're the ones with the least amount of time.
yeah.
So, even if it's only temporary, succession management, putting in place capacity for allowing and handing over responsibilities to allow key members of staff to actually move on to the system and then bring their knowledge back to the business after that implementation process.
Yeah.
So that's where the biggest underestimate is how much time we need from those key users. Having
Mm,
somebody who's only there 2 hours a week when he's the critical person doesn't help when he comes back in later and say, oh, I could have told you that, or no, that's not going to work, but it wasn't around at the time. That's the most frustrating thing I find in implementations, because that with the right people in place you could have done such a much better job in a much shorter time.
yeah, absolutely. So what's an example of a perfectly designed planning model that failed in the real world, and why? Probably can't mention any names, I'm
No,
sure.
not at all, not at all, not at all. To admit that I've done a perfectly planned system that failed in the real world is, yeah, okay. Well, I think looking back, I got introduced to demand driven back in 2018, so I've been an advocate of it for the past sort of 7-8 years. I think just before then I was working in an electronics company, and we were trying to put in upgrade the system, revisit all the engineering data, do a big cleanse, and put master planning in place. And we did everything right, just by the book, all in the right place. But we never got the recommendations out of the system that we wanted, and it got to a silly point where we were, you could run master planning on a Friday night, go home for the weekend, run it on a Sunday night. So nothing happened Saturday, nothing happened Sunday, and master planning would come up with 30,000 change recommendations on this system. And you think, yeah, how did that happen? Because it looks at a date, extrapolates a date, and if it falls within a band, it does a different decision-making process. And that was the thing that really made me appreciate how unstable master planning can be.
Mm,
Needless to say, that drove a different mindset and a different outcome when we accepted that classical MRP is not going to cut it in this company, and hence here I am now, hopefully talking about demand driven, making a lot more sense for people than I did then.
yeah, absolutely. So that kind of takes us on to our next section. So you've taken a lot of this experience and built something alongside D365. What gaps were you consistently seeing that led you down that route?
Well, I say, what Microsoft provide as part of D365 supply chain management is that they have a module master planning. It's driven by this solution called planning optimization. It's a wonderful mathematical model. It can number crunch huge amounts of data very, very fast, and cause chaos in its road if it runs 10 times a day and gives you 10 different answers. So what I wanted to do was to bring the full suite of functionality that you need for buffer management and the demand-driven methodology, and build that into D365. Microsoft have brought in the concept of decoupling points as part of planning optimization, which is a good stepping stone, and the basic calculations. But what was missing was all the management tools, the appropriate KPIs that we're talking about, and also then the extensions that can be driven from that. Because once you have the concept of I'm looking at inventory from the point of view of not matching supply and demand and trying to make them match each other, but actually what level of inventory do we need to manage, you can then look at operationally what are the priorities on my existing purchase orders, my priorities on my manufacturing, based on where the need is for inventory, more than across across different SKUs. So all of that prioritization and all that management control is what we've tried to bring into the module.
Yeah.
So leveraging all standard functionality, leveraging all the data. There's no data requirement changes needed in D365 to support all this. It's merely a case of looking at the data that D365 has in a different way.
Yeah.
And that comes back down to the mindset of the user and understanding it, and then with a suitable amount of education, then based around demand-driven principles, then you can just change the way you do planning on D365 completely.
Yeah. Okay. So at what point should organizations consider extending D365 planning rather than trying to force native functionality to do everything?
Well, I think what you find there is if we accept that all the data is in D365, if it's not in all D365, because in organizations that are quite complex, D365 might not be the only ERP system, then there's definitely value in considering third-party solutions to try and bring a holistic view of all that data together. But for those organizations which have made the effort to bring and consolidate the data within D365, then the tools are there. Again, it's how you use them and what you're trying to achieve with them more than anything else. There's less of a need now with the functionality that's in planning optimization, what's in demand planning apps, the enhancements that we've developed. The combination of all those means that native D365 functionality can deliver the true business benefits that people are looking for with a slightly different mindset.
So what should companies have firmly in place before they even think about looking at planning add-on or tool?
Well, I think that the key thing about all of this is the people. Forget the data, forget what you're trying to do. It's sitting down with the people, educating them in a different mindset of how you can approach planning, and then working that through and seeing how those scenarios can work out on their particular requirements. If you've got a customer recently I was talking to who specifically has to ship everything in. They're in an isolated part of the world. Everything has to be containerized. Constraint of volume and weight drives most of their mindset thinking. So that has to be built into any planning recommendation. You might need something, but if it can't fit in the containers that you've got on order, then you're not going to get it. So constraint management is, which also includes concepts of capacity and constraint, etc. Constraint management is a critical thing. But generally, in terms of before you do anything, it's educating the people, making them understand what's the art of the possible now, and then because most people will not have formal planning education. Most planners and senior operations people across the world don't have it. They've learned on the job. They've learned from the person next to them. Those that have done formal planning tend to have learned traditional MRP and master planning type functionality, and just are generally just not aware of the possibilities that can be applied with a different viewpoint. And I suppose in terms of where we are now, the tools that we've got to play with, and you can't avoid the AI discussion. The last thing you want to do with AI is to introduce that with methodologies that mean that they'll just automate what master planning did even quicker and across the board. And if master planning is not really a stable solution, then heaven forbid how unstable AI could be if it's promoting change faster than the human can react.
Yeah. So what's the wrong reason to buy a planning solution?
I suppose that the obvious thing to say there is to think that it will just magically solve all your problems. At the end of the day, no planning solution will do it on its own. It's down to the decisions that you make on it and the management control of it.
The data that goes into it, presumably.
Absolutely, and I think I think what's missing from a lot of systems nowadays is a recognition that what businesses actually want from their planning systems is predictability and stability. what they often get from their systems is reactiveness and activity, trying to keep things going, juggling everything and having to chase. So I think planning systems that can offer stability is what people should be looking for.
Okay. It's good advice. So hopefully there will be a lot of supply chain leaders or manufacturing companies that are listening to this. So if a supply chain leader is about to start or reset their D365 planning journey, what should they focus on in the first 90 days? That feels like an interview question.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. I suppose it mirrors what we've already talked about. Is that it's don't start doing detail work. Don't start thinking that we've got to just forecast better. Take one step back. Think about the methodology that you're applying. Think about what the results you're trying to achieve with the system, and then educate the people that are going to be running the system. The idea that you can just improve incrementally based on old 60-year-old methodology. If anything else was 60 years old nowadays, people would not just assume that it was fit for purpose, but for some reason we just still assume that the fundamental principles of master planning are still appropriate, and they drive a lot of the solutions that we've got now. So to take one step back, rethink how that works, educate the people, and then start slowly with a new implementation methodology. I tend to find that data that's in a system, unless things have gone really awry, is normally okay. There's always room for improvement. People talk about data accuracy, etc. But in supply chain, with all the transactions that occur, you tend to find that big problems big data issues are taken care of because they have to be as a natural consequence of what's happening. What you get is a lot of noise. There's a lot of small stuff that's wrong with data in supply chain. The problem there then becomes, where's my priority in terms of making improvements? And then you make all these improvements, and then things change and move on again. You could spend 3 months just refining and making sure you've got all the perfect lead times in the system, and then all those lead times change because we have an incident like we see at the moment in the Strait of Hormuz or whatever. So data, I tend to find is it shouldn't be the driving force. I think if you put the right systems in place, then part of those systems should be constant, ongoing data management. It should be a natural consequence of the system that data accuracy and data variation is flagged as part of that process. Because as we talked about, with supply chains changing all the time, unless you keep up to date, then you're not going to get planning recommendations that are accurate. So to assume that you can set everything up perfectly, 3 years ago and it's still valid now, it's just, that's you're on a hiding to nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. So a year into a successful planning program, what feels different for the planning team day to day?
Well, if you get it right, I don't think you need to leave it a year. I think I'd say the one thing that shows that a planning solution is working for them is that actually they have time to cope with all the noise that they have to cope with. It's a case of, if you've got an 80% fit with the business processes, and then 20% is always going to be something that you have to manually react and manage, you want to make that 80% as easy to manage, as easy as possible, so it doesn't take 80% of your time up. So giving planners time to take control of those areas that they actually need to control with. You see buyers that are actually more like expediters rather than contract managers. They don't have time to do the important things because they're so busy doing the small day-to-day stuff. We can take the noise out of the system, do the day-to-day stuff, and then give them time back to do the important value adds that they should be doing, and that's what they should be employed to do.
Yeah, fantastic. So finally, last question. If listeners take just one thing away from this conversation, what should it be?
I suppose to me, it's the classic that, if you do the same thing all the time, then don't expect a different result. If you want to improve things dramatically, you need to rethink why you're doing it and what you're doing, and then be prepared to try something different. I think, for me, so many implementations I've done with planning started off, this is what I need to do, this is what I want to happen, and then you have to go through that education process and ask the classic why questions to get to the truth of what they're trying to achieve. So be open to new ideas, and certainly nowadays we've got lots of options on the table that can improve things.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, thank you very much for your time and going through everything with me. And I hope that the listeners have taken away as much as they can from that. To the listeners, if you do want to reach out and talk any more around D365 planning, then do reach out to me. I can put you in touch with Roger. It's always open to having conversations with people. And yeah, just thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it. If
Pleasure.
anybody wants to follow Roger, then him on LinkedIn, I'm sure, as you can also connect yourself and also source and connect on LinkedIn as well. So yeah, thank you very much.